a little song I wrote. You might want to sing it note for note. Don't worry. Be happy.
Hey everybody, welcome to the lecture slideshow on emotion. Were that it was so easy, huh? Although music is really a good modulator of emotion, isn't it? So we're back to our audio lectures and let's dive right in. First of all, with operational definition, what is emotion? Pretty much recognized as a four-part experience that includes physical arousal, right? Energy. That's what you can think of when you see the word arousal. Subjective feelings. We all have different feelings. We have similar feelings associated to an emotion, like, feeling like we're punched in the gut, for example, but we'll feel emotions to different extents, right, to different levels. And then we have how we interpret emotions, and then we have a behavioral expression of emotions. So you can see on this child's face, not happy. All right, and we can also see from this child's face that we can immediately read this child's face and feel what that child is feeling a little bit. And that's one of the reasons why we understand that emotions are really very, especially emotional expressions, are very much for social communication. And they enable us to do a great deal, right? So two hunters trying to communicate across a big field can communicate a great deal of information through facial expressions and gestures. Affect is another word that is frequently used in psychology that refers to emotion and particularly emotional expression. This child is displaying a good deal of affect, emotional affect. This unit looks at both emotion and motivation, so just want to point out that both of these are involved with movement and energy. Emotion, energy and motion, is one way to think of it. Emotion and motivation both get us moving. Motivation is based on I think it's Latin motere, to move. All right, so we're going to look at these four parts of our experience of emotion. The first part is physical arousal, which is energy, and we talked about this already relative to the stress unit, and we learned about the sympathetic and parasympathetic states of the nervous system. And here we have a positive sympathetic state, right? We have high arousal but positive emotion. So we have positive feelings going on, and then we can also have high arousal with negative feelings, negative emotion, which mostly we talk about as anxiety, anger, fear, or sorrow. Then we can have parasympathetic state, low arousal, with positive feelings, relaxed and stay safe, like this child right here. But if we're lying here, right here, like this child shows a facial expression of real relaxation. But if we're lying there like that and we're ruminating over fears or anxieties, then we're not in a parasympathetic state. And one of the things that was emphasized in the stress unit is that negative feelings are stressful physically. Positive feelings, energy is stressful. It's just, if you think about stress as basically wear and tear on the system, and the system can't go forever and needs to be rejuvenated, right? But negative feelings, you can think of it like too much sugar. It's okay in short bursts, but a terrible regular diet because it's too much, it's too caustic for the system. The second part is subjective feelings, and for this, it's really important to understand a baseline thing, and you can think about the people around you in terms of this and yourself. And we have the distribution curve here again, of course, and just recognizing that some people feel emotions very intensely and for long periods of time, and other for less intensely and short periods of time. And we can apply that to different emotions. So say maybe you worry a lot and somebody else doesn't worry a lot, but they're really they get very anxious if things aren't totally organized or if they don't flow, right? So we all have different ways that we respond to emotions and feel them in our body. And just generically, some people feel them much more intensely than others, and they know who they are. They know they're highly sensitive people. And we've already talked in the last unit, in the brain unit, and made some connections, which is why we're tying these together in terms of order with the brain structure of the amygdala. And now your awareness that these are actual structures, right? So there's a difference between somebody who has small hands and large hands, or a nose that has a lot of olfactory receptors and a nose that has fewer olfactory receptors. I mean, there's just basic structural differences, and there's differences between people who have different sizes of the amygdala, right? And we can also influence the size of the amygdala by how we're operating in life, the life experiences we have, and then how we respond to those stressors. And that's that third portion, the cognitive interpretation, how we respond to the stressors. And now we're learning that we can become more aware of how we're thinking about things and begin to shift those into ways that are more not fantasy, like, not rose colored glasses nonsense, but rather powerful, strengthening, accurate, and strengthening. So the reality is that it's more accurate, and you've probably heard about this as CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and we'll be talking about that as we go along the line. But you know what it is now already. It's changing the way you think. And our example of this was Kelly McGonigal and her idea, and we'll have more examples of it. Her idea of reframing the way that we think about stress. So it's our cognitive interpretation influences things. So the definition, the meaning and personal significance of an emotion are rooted in how we interpret it and experience, how we cognitively frame it. Then we have the behavioral expression. We can all sense what this child is wanting, right? We can all sense that this child is wanting something. And so once again, the idea that emotions really are rooted, especially emotional expressions, trying to relay this expression to somebody else. Because if you think about things like reptiles and snakes, we don't have emotional expressions. But when we have care of young, we start to see this emotional expression. We think it originates there with the caregiving process and the young being able to express social needs as well as physical needs, right? And there's a structure called mirror neurons, something we've just started to learn about maybe less than 10 years ago. They're throughout our brain, and they enable us to mimic and copy other people, and they also mirror the feeling inside of ourselves, a little bit of it, in the limbic system, so that we know what this child's feeling. We'll talk about mirror neurons later because they're very interesting in that they're one of the things that goes on with autism is we have fewer clusters of mirror neurons, so harder time interpreting these kinds of emotional expressions, and more of a discomfort with faces, more of a feeling of confusion over faces for that reason. Okay, so emotions are very contagious, especially for some people, more so for some people than others, because you just put a distribution curve here, emotional contagion, and how much you are sensitive to other people's emotions. And that's, of course, going to be partly environmental, because if you were raised in an environment where you needed to be paying hyper attention, if you needed to be hyper alert because it was somewhat dangerous or aggressive kind of home environment, then you're going to be very sensitive to people's emotions. So it matters, the emotional tone that we go around the world in. It does influence other people. People pick it up. You've picked up other people's emotional tone that you've been around. And this is a charming video. See if you can watch this super short video and not laugh, of the cutest baby in the world, in my opinion. Check it out. It's really fun. It's just a couple of minutes. So moods, you probably know or have the sense of, they're longer lasting sort of clusters of emotions. Usually we rank moods as, I'm in a bad mood, I'm in a good mood. We start with the good and bad, where there's more of a cluster of positive or a cluster of negative emotions together, and it's something that seems to endure or last a little while. In the sleep and dream segment, we'll talk about why sometimes we can wake up in a bad mood after a bad dream. But, and in fact, people who wake up shortly after dreams, because dreams tend to be negative, they're one of the ways that we do negative emotional processing, sort of frag it out of our brain. And one of the things that goes on with people who are depressed is that they wake up more often during REM sleep, during the part of the sleep in which you're dreaming. during which they're feeling a lot of negative affect, which of course taints and tailors the way that they feel. It resonates throughout the morning and so on. So they are, anyway, some theories are looking at the idea of waking up during REM sleep, the negative emotions experienced during REM sleep, too often as being actually a source of depression, a causal a variable. So, one of the things that we want to do is shift a lingering negative mood that is not in some way constructive to our being, right? Sometimes we go into states that are not, say, elated or not even necessarily positive, but they contain a richness to them and a learning and a growth. Pain often includes growth, but there's also pain, and we can sense it, that does not include growth, where we're just ruminating in a negative state. And that's something where you want to jump yourself out of the shift, pivot, find something else to do that will induce a new feeling state, whichever direction it will help to go. Now, for a lot of the textbook goes into this dimension of emotions, which is how they arise, and common sense idea, James Lang, Ken Bard, Shatner. I'll let you look over this in sort of relaxed way. This is sort of like which comes first, right? Do we have the stimulus that elicits immediately a feeling of fear, and we have a sense, I feel fear, and then we have a physical bodily reaction? Or do we have a stimulus that elicits bodily feelings or reactions like heightened heart rate and perspiration and amygdala anxiety, and then we interpret that as fear, right? Or do we see a stimulus and have both of these go on and sort of simultaneously? Or do we have them work as a feedback loop? And it's all of them. So this is very interesting to me that this dominated the dialogue and emotion back when I was in graduate school. And it was so clear to me that emotions were so core to driving human behavior, and so maddening that we limited our dialogue to this kind of thing. I mean, it's interesting, and especially when you go into it at deep layers, you'll realize that there's some interesting things about it, but it certainly isn't what's dialogued about today. In the mainstream about emotion, much more it's about emotional regulation and how do we deal with the difficult emotions, right? Now, little backtracking here, some things you kind of already know, right? In some ways, this is a repeat for you because we're connecting information from the brain and stress. But evolutionary purpose of emotion is to motivate our behavior, communicate needs, and social glue. Play is one of the most social gluing things you can do with animals or people. If you want to bond with people, play with them. And adults have all kinds of wonderful methods of play, but that's how you can do great repair, and children will love you if you play with them, and it's actually a very powerful way to actually train dogs. Play is core. If we don't have play, social glue, play. If we don't have play, we don't turn out right. All right, interesting research too, that when we're around positive people, it sort of regulates our amygdala for us. Our amygdala feels safe. It helps with the safety dimension of the amygdala, and so you can move into a more relaxed, positive state. But if the people around you are difficult and ornery and critical, and it induces anxiety states in you, and then obviously that won't happen. So one of the goals that you want to do is, and we all have people around us to various extents who are like that, so we want to counterbalance that, right? So you want to make sure that if you have people like that in your life, that it's important enough for you to tolerate that, to be with, then that you counterbalance by cultivating people in your life, consciously choosing to cultivate people that help you feel positive and good, right? All right, and we also talked about how the survival emphasis of emotions results in vulnerability to a negativity bias, because it's the negative emotions that are more important to keep us alive. As Rick Hansen says, the nervous squirrels stayed alive, the relaxed and groovy squirrels do not, right? So we have a little bit of a stack on the side of the negativity bias that can build up and accumulate over years. So if you're older, you may have noticed, and there's a film I post called The Truth About Personality, about a documentary about a man who goes in notices that he started off happier and he got more gloomy as he got older. And part of that is the accumulation of the negativity bias. Negative memories being over-remembered more than positive ones, and then that accumulates over time, and then, sort of slogs down the system. So we've also because of the biosection, looked some at the neurochemistry of emotion, and I just want to call your attention a little bit more here. Let's cement this in a little bit more right now. We've got epinephrine or adrenaline, right? We need this for energy and alertness. We need adrenaline. I mean, I wouldn't be sitting upright and have the energy to sit here and talk if I didn't have some adrenaline. But think of them like spices, right? Like seasonings where you want to have them at the right amount and at various amounts. And these are just a few of the neurotransmitters. There's also hormones that play a role and interact in this, and there's more. We're just beginning to map this out. So this is a whole world for you guys to sort out and figure out. And like I said, we're just starting. And then there's serotonin, which we need also for alertness. I mean, you're not awake without serotonin. And because we have the distribution curve, people are going to have different amounts of these in their brain naturally. It's going to be that some people have lower levels of serotonin in the brain by biological sort of birth, and then some have higher, right? Because it's with everything, this whole distribution curve. That's just how nature makes things go. And we can increase serotonin through a positive environment, and we can decrease serotonin through a negative environment, right? So serotonin also wakes up enough part of the prefrontal lobes of the brain. Remember, that's the part in front of the brain here, so that it can regulate the limbic system. Amygdala hijacks, whenever we rage, people going to rage and becoming violent and ending up in prison. We know that there's the people who are vulnerable to that are going through an experience in which the neural connections from the prefrontal lobes to the limbic system to be able to interrupt acting out violently on that aren't strong enough for various reasons, right? We could say biological and environmental. Right. And these are neural connections that can be built throughout our lives from the prefrontal lobe. I mean, every time we continually, this is why things like, doing a discipline or a practice, any kind of discipline or practice, like physical ones, say, for example, like a martial art or yoga or something like that, or sport, generalizes to other parts of your life because it's helping to build neural connections of discipline into this, and we can just keep building them. These prefrontal lobes too, of self-control, remember the executive center here in the front of the brain, they wear out, they get tired, they're like a muscle, and we can only use them for so long, and then they get so tired, and that's when we get vulnerable to going and eating too many cupcakes and things like that, right? Okay, and then we have dopamine, which is more associated with anticipation of pleasure, goal seeking, and therefore related to motivation. And motivation and emotion, motivation, they're like, the heads and tails of a coin. I should put that on there at the beginning somewhere because they work with each other back and forth, interacting with each other all the time. And dopamine is an emotional feeling of excitement, like the feeling of anticipation when you're about to go out on a really exciting date, or if you're going to go do something fun, super fun, like a concert, or you're just anticipating something good, even anticipating a good grade being returned on a test, or anticipating bringing home flowers to a loved one and the happy face that you'll see when you give them to them, any kind of anticipatory. And of course, it's the hook being used in like slot machines, and even Facebook is, because you get a little dopamine burst, boom, 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 every time you get a hit, right? Like. So dopamine. And so we create addiction through this cycle, drives and addiction. So dopamine is very much involved, and you have to have a minimum amount of serotonin to keep the prefrontal lobes awake enough to be able to regulate the limbic system. Okay, and there's various things, epigenetic factors that can delete people's serotonin. So these are very much biological realities. It's not just in your mind, right? Okay, more on neurotransmitters and emotion. You can reflect on this slide. All right, a review again of the nervous system. We have the central, brain and spinal cord, peripheral, with the 2 dimensions, which is everything else, right? And then 2 parts of the peripheral is somatic, voluntary actions, and autonomic, which are mostly involuntary processes like these, but we can influence them, right? And our autonomic system, which runs behind the scenes with some very ancient structures that are extremely intelligent. Look at the intelligence behind all this, right? Brilliant, intelligent, a lot more intelligent than our very young, relatively very new cognition here in the prefrontal lobes, has a sympathetic and parasympathetic division. So it's either the brakes are on or the accelerator's on, right? And we need this or we burn out. It's just like you can't keep your car pedal to the metal. So this would be a good slide to copy paste on your desktop so that you know this until you know this, because this is definitely something that you want to know. Okay, too much arousal plus negative emotion is what we refer to as stressed out, right? To adrenaline plus cortisol. So sources of psychological stress we talked about from, or you read about, and we discussed in various ways from the last chapter. And intense really related to control. We need to have sort of a balance in our lives of excitement and control, which is a yin-yang kind of relationship, right? But too much lack of control and we feel overwhelmed, and this can happen externally or internally. And these are some ways that we can feel out of control, right? And if it's too much out of control, then it's a lot of stress on the system. This is why sometimes people will say, if you're having a really stressful day, just try to do something small like make your bed, because it begins to generate a micro feeling of control that then you can, just build on. Next, do a couple dishes, next, so that you get a sense of feeling strength back, right? But sometimes you're in an environment which is overwhelming, and we need larger tools for that. Okay, Seyle's general adaptation syndrome. This is basically saying that, this is from the stress unit again, and it doesn't even have to be shock. It can just be waking up and going into action, going, and then you get tired and you collapse, right? And then you need to recover. So the question is, how well is this recovery? How well do we restore? Because if we don't restore well, then over time we become increasingly depleted. And of course, we live in a society which is very fast paced, so and runs differently than any other human society because of the speed and pace. So we got to sort things out. The nice thing is we've got some new knowledge that we didn't have before. We're going to need it because we have a lot of challenges, right? And one of them is the speed and pace of the world that we live in, and being able to implement a healthy enough lifestyle to be able to feel good in it. And we talked about the stress brain loop, right? Chronic stress. It reduces our ability, it reduces prefrontal lobe function, okay? And then reduces our ability for us to manage our limbic system and the negative emotions from the limbic system. Chronic stress, as you also know, shrinks the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is involved in new learning. The next chapter we're going to do after this is learning. And the reason why the hippocampus isn't here, and the reason why this shrinking the hippocampus matters so much, is because it's not just this kind of learning. It's also when we learn, when we get over a former love that we end up broken up with, that the relationship doesn't work out, and we get healthy and strong again after the sadness part and processing it, what's happening is that we are learning, we're expanding our worldview and learning that we can move forward, that our world is bigger and we can build and grow a world that is very happy, alive, and full. And past that relationship. And then when we get over something like a phobia or a fear, it's new learning. We still feel we can reduce the amount of reactivity to some extent, But a lot of it is also increasing the amount of a person's sense of courage about being able to tackle this or that thing. So this is learning. These are learning, and that's why we need learning. We need that hippocampus. Exercise strengthens the hippocampus and is a major antidote to the shrinking that happens from stress and time. So how much if there's a certain point where our learning crashes, right? It goes way down. We go up and then it goes down. And what makes it up is our enthusiasm about a subject, our interests, our higher goals, our motivation, the sense of support that we have, the quality of supports that we have, education, teaching, things like that. And then what makes learning crash is when we start to feel overwhelmed. There it is, where the situation's out of our control. We can't stay up. So you always want to reach out before you start to crash, right? And find help here. And know that we're always going to need to find help here. So we want to stay up here with our learning. If we're down here, then we're not, like, we're bored. We're not motivated enough. So we want to make sure we stay up at the high. Now, we also talked about how chronic stress will hypersensitize the amygdala. This is long-term stress that goes on over a long period of time. And notice that it will shade memories of experiences that happen with negative emotion, resulting in a vague feeling of background upset, and it can just escalate, right? So what we're doing is we're getting a brain that's getting used to incubating in negative emotion, and the neural connections get used to firing, and once they get used to firing, they become like roads and they just fire. So this is the process we want to interrupt, and why the opposite process is a wise one to engage in, just period, of strengthening the mind. Various different things, which we'll talk about toward the end of this slideshow. And we also talked about, well, this is the same thing. The stress response system results in adrenaline and cortisol, which hyperactivate the limbic system and underactivate the PFC. And it shifts our cognitive appraisals or interpretations of other people's behavior. Why we think, when we're appraising something, we're like, why we think something's happening. So our cognitive appraisals or our interpretations start shifting in more of a negative direction. Again, they get clouded by sort of a negative tint. And then we have the emotion and cognition feedback loop that's going on all the time. The idea that how we think influences how we feel, influences how we think, and then reverse. How we feel influences how we think, influences how we feel. So, for example, when we feel a lot of stress, it stores up. Adrenaline and cortisol store up in our muscles. This is why football players take baths. That's what I should say. Because it stores up in our muscles. And so then we'll have a feedback loop from our muscles to our mind telling us that we are feeling stress. And then we start thinking about stressful things, right? Because as we learned in the brain unit, let's see, how is it? Memory is state specific. So the way we think is related to our emotional state. Remember, if we're in a good mood, we tend to easily be able to remember the good things in our lives. When we're in a bad mood, we tend to more easily be able to remember the negative things in our life, the things that aren't going as well as we want them to go. So a couple other aspects of stress that we talked about is that we can imagine ourselves into stressful fear or anger states through mental processing and ruminating. And one of the antidotes to this that, again, is a Navy SEALs antidote in their program for mental toughness is to focus on visualizing the outcome you intend or want rather than what you're worried about. And then, of course, that stimulates taking action because, of course, they're very much into taking action too, not just intending. But you want to mentally be focusing on what you want a lot more than what you don't want. Cognitive framing is a massive subject that we'll be looking at throughout the semester because it's so interesting how we're always learning about how we perceive and interpret things, how we structure the frame around it really skews how we see it. And so it's smart to be really wise to that and very aware of it. So we can frame an experience to ourselves in a way that helps us see ourselves as in a heroic role where that experience has meaning or where we come out as a victim. And these will have two totally different outcomes in terms of the person's self-perception and how they behave. We can also use framing to diffuse, for example, saying I'm so irked versus I'm so furious, to shift, and noticing how much we hyperinflate the volatility of a situation through our language, and instead using language to, deflate and calm things down. Kelly McGonigal was a great example with how our cognitive framing about the emotions that we feel when we're stressed, how we can think about those as our body generating courage and power within ourselves. And then we are perhaps not so afraid of them, and that shifts a lot. So, emotion and cognition, CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, and many of you have heard of it. It's a big, powerful part of therapy and something that is incredibly effective. So it's about how we talk to ourselves. It's not about just being unreasonably positive about ourselves. It's rather about being reasonably reasonable, and also being strengthening, right? Approaching things more as an inner coach than as a demoralizing critic. So we'll be looking at that quite a bit as we go forward. There's also an idea that I want to introduce to you here called the locus of control. It's another idea we'll be looking at also again later down the line, but let's get introduced to it here. And this is the extent to which we feel we have power over the events in our lives in a situation. People who have an internal locus of control have a sense that they can tackle what's going on. They feel that they're strong enough to deal with the challenges they're dealing with. When we feel overwhelmed, we tend to shift our sense of locus of control to out there, that we don't have the power. One of the major roles or goals of therapy and working with a counselor is to help a person shift from this mental state to this state. Maybe not quite to this state, but move more in that direction. So, emotional expression. This is facial expressions, as well as body language. And as you already know, that we are all over the world, we can recognize these facial expressions. And now we're going to be introduced to the gentleman who made that possible. This is Paul Ekman doing work in Papua New Guinea, where he went, and this will show you, this video here will show you how he did it, how he found out that even people in Papua New Guinea would be able to recognize faces. He showed them little cards, for example, that was a card of, and say, okay, this person just lost their house to a fire. Which facial expression most matches their experience? And people were universally able to get it right. And that's how he proved. Back then they weren't sure about that people all over the world could recognize facial expressions, but Ekman proved it. This is him as a young man proving it in the wild, not in the wild, in Papua New Guinea. And then he came back, and he's the guy behind the Lie to Me TV series, if any of you watch that, about micro expressions. You're already familiar that we have 7 biologically based universal emotional expression amongst humans and even mammals. And then this is another little mention that it's mirror neurons in our limbic system that enable us to recognize these expressions on these people's faces, because the mirror neurons mirror in us kind of a little bit of what they're feeling. So we feel it on a smaller level. And of course, you can put the distribution curve here for how intensely these facial expressions might, cause your brain to react. Now, people and some other animals too, but certainly people can mask or hide our emotions. And so we can show a smile, for example, but it's not a real smile in this video that is really hiding or masking another kind of emotion, right? So this video talks about that, how to tell if a smile is real or not. And then we have micro expressions. Now, this is Paul Ekman again, who just painstakingly looked at different kinds of emotions and what the eyes were doing when the person was, what the brow was doing, what the lips were doing, whenever a person was feeling these kinds of emotions, and then coding it. And now with computers, of course, they can slow video down and run it through this coding system and be able to tell what a person was feeling. And we have this tendency to, when we want to disguise a feeling, it's actually hard for us. It's actually hard for humans to lie, most of them. So it takes more cognitive effort to lie than to not lie. And people therefore have to work to hide the real emotions that they're feeling. And so they can leak out. They often do, except for, as Ekman will describe, master liars. They'll leak out and in just like 1/20th of a second or shorter, these small little micro expressions that reveal what the person's really feeling. So you can learn about micro expressions on this video, and this one shows you using micro expressions. This is a short micro expression, and they'll talk about, on the media, how to detect lies. This is a major tool that, Heckman's using, that has been, that is part of the Homeland Security now. So very much more effective than lie detector tests. So one of those kinds of new variables with technology that has pros and cons that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. So people can be trained at spotting micro expressions, and it's a common training now. Here's a fun micro expression test that you can take. And there's also important to know the difference between expressions, which is like the smile, and gestures, which is the thumbs up. And gestures are cultural, right? So like the peace sign is a gesture, whereas the basic emotional expressions are universal. Although different cultures have different what's called display rules for emotional expression. Different, like some cultures, say Italy, you can be much more expressive about your feelings than you can, say, in Asian countries, where emotions, especially powerful ones, are culturally preferred to be more subdued. So emotional display rules is what that's called. Those can still be cultural too, but the basic emotions, how they show up on the face as a smile or not a smile, for example, are universal. And then we have the idea of emotional regulation. And this is very big science right now in a super exciting area. And it only started coming out around in the 1990s, where people really started paying attention to emotional regulation, even though this is really what's going on behind so many of the psychological disorders, right? Whenever you think about disorders and emotional regulation, you can see that emotional dysregulation, things that become out of control in terms of the negative emotion, is what's going on over here. And then having high emotional regulation, especially the ability to handle negative emotions, is, tends to be the state that we consider feeling strong and resilient. So emotional regulation is major, and building high, preventing slipping down and building strength is the emphasis of today, right? Because we all go through a lot of difficulties in life, some more than others, of course. But now we are aware that we can become more and more resilient in facing those difficulties, or less and less resilient. And we all start somewhere on this today, right? We've all had advantages and disadvantages that put us somewhere on this continuum today, where we've had a really rough background or we've had a really great background, and so we're already really strong, but we can still have some major challenges, boom, 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 right, that knock us down here. And so we need the tools that move up here. And if we're down here, then we can still use tools to move way up here, right? So that's one of the things, that's neuroplasticity. We can change our brain through what we do. Now, emotional intelligence and the Marshmallow test. This particular test is the most charming thing, one of the most charming things you'll see. Like totally worth it, like the angry baby one, right? And we're give me the evil eye. And this one is these kids are put in a room, and it was done at Stanford, and it's a longitudinal study. They follow them up 20 years later. They put these like 3 and 4-year-olds in a room, and 5-year-olds, and said, okay, you've got a marshmallow, and if you can wait a couple minutes, you'll get 2 marshmallows. But if you just want to eat the marshmallow, that's okay. And so what they were measuring was the kids' ability to delay gratification, exert impulse control, and sustained focus on the higher goal of waiting for the 2 marshmallows, right? Now, it turns out, can you believe, that these 3 things, the ability to do these 3 things, and in fact, the marshmallow test, was more predictive of success in college than the SAT. I'm going to repeat that. Success at passing, waiting for the second marshmallow, being able to wait long enough for the second marshmallow, which reflected these 3 qualities of what's now referred to as emotional intelligence, was more predictive of success in college than the SAT. They also did better on the SAT. So very interesting. This will show you the test. Okay, so again, it measured delayed gratification, impulse control, and the ability to focus on the higher goal of waiting for the second marshmallow in a longitudinal study, which means a study conducted over a long period of time. And they followed the kids up 20 more years later, and they found that the kids who couldn't wait to eat the marshmallow had more challenges with these things, right? But that doesn't mean that they're doomed or anything. It just means that these 3 things are very correlated with our ability to perform well in life, because it means that we'll drop the temptation soon enough to stay focused on our higher goal strong enough to get there, right? All right. So since then, emotional intelligence has been described or outlined in lots of different ways. Here's a handy matrix for it where you can think about personal self-intelligence and social intelligence on one side. And over here, we've got regulation, and they put recognition here, but we could think of awareness, right? So we have self-awareness and social awareness. And we have self-regulation and social regulation, right? And so we have self-awareness here, including accurate self-assessment, which for a lot of people means being willing to own your strengths, right? And stepping into a state of personal, let's say, sense of personal confidence in your own legitimate abilities and skills. I just watched the movie Wonder Woman with my husband, and I liked the reflection that she reflects that kind of confidence in realistic abilities and skills. Of course, she's superhuman, but I'm just talking about how she exuded a sense of realistic self-awareness, not undervaluing one's skills, abilities, and not overvaluing them either, right? And then another aspect of self-awareness is being able to know what you like and what's important to you and what kind of environments you will thrive in, and moving towards those kinds of environments, right? So that you can do well in them. I'll talk more about that another time. So then we have self-regulation, self-management, and this is managing drive and motivation and impulse control and staying focused on a goal and being conscientious and being able to adapt and change to life events. I know you guys are all recognizing these as adult life skills that you've got to really master, because life again is very challenging. And then we have social awareness, which is the ability to read other people's faces and understand how they're feeling. Organizational awareness, understanding the environment around us, right? And social skills, social regulation, the ability to influence other people, lead, guide, direct, get along well with. Okay. So here, emotional intelligence skills, you can see some of the kinds of behaviors that people have when they have low emotional intelligence compared to high emotional intelligence. Okay, and I'm sure many of you have worked with people or have bosses at various ranges of high or low emotional intelligence, and it makes a real difference. And again, this is something that we can cultivate in people. These are skills we can learn, like reading, writing, and arithmetic. And emotional intelligence is now being taught in schools more. So it's pretty exciting. For our purposes, I want to remind you of the Navy SEALs program for mental toughness, or we could call it emotional intelligence. And they are keeping things focused or simple with 4 basic principles, right? Now, recognize that the Navy SEALs or any kind of program like that is already implementing a lot of discipline. So now they're doing the mind part of the training. In other words, people in that environment already know what they have to do every day, and they get pushed to do what they have to do every day. So we could think about us approaching that from the next unit, or the other half of this unit, motivation, when we talk about that next. But in terms of discipline and behaving. But here we're talking about what's going on in the mind. And for focus, what they are talking about is staying focused on the goal that's right in front of you and not giving up, right? Even though the going gets really rough, right? And this is related to motivation. So that's what they mean by focus, right? Keeping your eye on the prize, keeping it right in front of you. And visualization is keeping that prize right in front of you, and imagining you succeeding at that, and imagining what it's going to take for you to succeed, and imagining, I mean, athletes, say, for example, a soccer player will visualize themselves in their mind at night lying down over and over and over and over and over doing a particular move, getting it just right in their mind's eye. And that's actually rehearsal. It shows up the same as if we're doing it without the motor cortex of the brain active at the same time. It's actually stunning information. So visualizations are very important. Our mind's a powerful tool. Self-talk, it's very common and easy for this self-talk to become negative because we do comparison with everybody around us, which isn't particularly useful unless we're doing it usefully, unless we're trying to get realistic information in order to make positive changes out of it. But to just ruminate negatively about negative comparisons with ourselves is completely unstrengthening. And so we want to train ourselves and train our minds, so our internal dialogue, and this is something that can take some time. It can take a few years to really get it on, but you can absolutely do it. And having a coach to help you do it, which we currently call a counselor, or a therapist, having a coach to help you shift the way your mind talks to you is a really valuable thing to spend a little bit of time doing, so that it'll reap years and years and years of rewards, right? Because you don't have to be, especially if your talk is on the demoralizing side, it's just not necessary. If you notice that your talk is like that and it's just completely unfair, then, decide that you owe yourself better. You deserve better than that, and you deserve to give the world better than that. So that can be changed. We have therapy through Chico State. We have therapists here on Butte College. We have peer counseling therapy through Chico State. I'll put these in the bonus point module, how to connect with changing negative self-talk. And of course, it's a great training program that is part of different kinds of courses, like martial art courses, athletic courses, psychology of yoga courses, things like that. And then arousal control is related to learning how to manage your internal state and becoming more aware of your internal state by using breath and breath exercises. And these are those Navy SEALs from the History Channel of the Brain. Now this slide is about learning how to calm down your autonomic nervous system using the breath. We tend to live in a hyperventilating society that doesn't ever take deep breaths. And so we're constantly telling our bodies that we're stressed out. And this is a habit from moving quickly. So as you can see over here, we want to slow down our breathing. And we wanted to have deep belly breaths. And this is one of the best Navy SEALs, most decorated Navy SEALs in the country, walking you through box breathing and a couple of other breathing techniques that you can use at any time, sitting in line, waiting for class to begin, before bed, anytime like this, to just calm down your mind. Now, how intensely you do it is obviously you got to match it to the situation. You don't want to do any kind of meditation before you get behind the wheel of a car, for example. But conscious breathing, slowing down and making your breath more intentional, is a very valuable tool throughout your life. I mean, unbelievably valuable tool. In fact, so core that you've got, the training going on here through the Navy SEALs. The pillars of emotional balance, because our brain runs through our whole body, it's really hard to have solid emotional regulation if we're not managing it through all of these. These are physiological ones. How we eat influences our brain, that. And so shifting better and better towards the way of eating that we know will fuel our body and cells and brain right. Getting used to moving around, sleeping well, and then social connections, positive social connections, having a deep, these are well, this one is real biophysical still, but having a deep sense of meaning and experiences of joy and play so that you have positive emotions running through your body, and your body's used to producing positive neurotransmitters, and it just doesn't go, I'm not going to bother making any positive neurotransmitters because this person doesn't really, my person I'm in doesn't seem to really want to experience them. We also need meaning. We're meaning creatures, and we'll talk more about that as we go along, but feeling a deep sense of meaning in our lives. So beginning in any one of these, to improve any one of these, will help us with emotional balance. And the idea is that we're going to need to keep strong emotional equilibrium. We want to invest in each of these. And we'll talk about them as we go along. This one, we start off focusing on the breath. The other is, we've already talked in previous units about practicing the idea of taking in the good. Another way of thinking about it is just asking yourself each night, what's going well in my life? And there's actually, if you can't induce feeling gratitude, you can say, what is going well? And to do that on a regular basis, to shift the mind from overemphasizing what's going wrong. And you're literally counter training here, right? This is, if you didn't watch this video by Louis Schwartzberg, this is him on nature, beauty, gratitude. I guarantee you'll feel like it's well worth it. And it'll induce a feeling of appreciation in life like nothing else I've ever seen. One of the bonus point modules I put up was about self-directed neuroplasticity. Richard Davidson, neuroscientist, talking about how we can consciously choose to change the wiring of our brain, right? And that's part of what this slide is all about. Now, this is Paul Ekman again. This is him today. These are two very powerful talks on mastering emotions and working with emotions. And just like Sapolsky is one of the world's leading experts on stress today, Ekman is without a doubt one of the world's leading experts. I think he was also from Stanford before he went independent, on emotions and emotional regulation and emotional expression. So well worth looking at. And then this is the shift. This slide, and I'm trying to remember his name, reflects the way that mindsets are changing about thinking about emotions. And I find this video to be very moving and very valuable. The perspective, like Kelly McGonigal, he shifts your perspective and how you think about things. Guy Finch, is that what it is? Anyway, I really hope you guys watch this video and talk about it. I know there's a lot of videos in this little slideshow, so try to get in most of them, okay? And if not all of them, and then notice what other people write about, and maybe you'll go back and want to watch all the rest of them if you don't get them all in, because I know there's quite a few, and I've still got to do the motivation lecture. All right. Whoa, it worked. My first, although I'm just already so tired of looking at that. My first GIF. I'm not liking it. But anyway, bonus point discussions are now posted, opportunities to earn extra credit, and essentially apply the information that you're learning, okay? So this class is mostly about psychology, and you don't get as much about how do I apply this that I'm learning, and so that's what the bonus point discussions are going to be about. And of course, we learn best by talking about these things with one another and writing them down and reflecting on them through social engagement. So, all right, that's it, you guys. By tomorrow, I hope to get the motivation one posted, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.